Becky Lynch breaks down in tears after devastating news about Seth Rollins' injury. You won't believe what doctors revealed about Seth Rollins' condition after his knee injury, and Becky Lynch's emotional reaction says it all. In this heartbreaking update from WWE, Becky Lynch is seen in tears backstage after doctors reveal shocking new details about Seth Rollins' fractured knee. The emotional toll is real, and fans are left wondering about Rollins' future in the ring. Is this the end of his championship dreams? Find out what really happened and how it impacts WWE moving forward. What if the love of your life was told he may never wrestle again? Backstage at WWE's Saturday Night Main Event, the air had been tense from the start. The kind of tension that coils silently in the space between a champion and a catastrophe. Seth Rollins, the visionary, the workhorse, the man who had carried the weight of Monday Night Raw on his surgically repaired knees, lay on the cold floor clutching one of them. Trainers rushed in. The arena, once filled with electric chants and fireworks, now held its breath. And somewhere beyond the curtain, Becky Lynch froze. The moment it happened, no one could predict how bad it was. Seth had landed awkwardly, a seemingly minor spot turned devastating in real time. At first, he brushed it off, limping his way through the remaining minutes of the segment. But by the time he was behind the curtain, the pain overwhelmed him. He collapsed, not in drama, but in silence. That silence would later echo through every hallway of the arena, carried not by screams, but by the unmistakable absence of certainty. Becky had seen him hurt before. She'd seen him bloodied, battered, and broken, but never like this. A WWE doctor, pale and tight-lipped, met her near Gorilla. He didn't speak. He only shook his head and motioned for her to follow. When she reached the medical room, she found Seth sitting on the edge of the table, hands trembling, sweat pouring from his face, and eyes that refused to meet hers. She called his name, and he didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew that if he looked at her, she'd see the truth. And she did. In that instant, the flame of their shared dream flickered. Seth Rollins. The man who danced through chaos, who laughed in the face of pressure, who promised their daughter that daddy always comes back, was suddenly human. Fragile. Uncertain. A man staring into the void that every performer fears but never speaks of. What if this is it? The medical evaluation was swift and cruel. A complete fracture of the medial ligament. Severe meniscus damage. The words poured out of the doctor's mouth like daggers, each more definitive than the last. Surgery would be immediate. Recovery, they said, could take 9 to 12 months. And even then, there were no guarantees. Becky Lynch didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply stood there, eyes welling up, mouth tight, hands clenched into fists so hard her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about a knee. This was about a man's identity, about everything he had built, sacrificed, and survived for. This was about what it means when your body no longer agrees with your purpose. And what it costs the person who loves you most to witness it. As WWE executives scrambled behind the scenes to rework storylines, shuffle SummerSlam plans, and contact outside specialists, Becky stayed by Seth's side. She didn't leave his room. She didn't return text messages. She didn't offer social media updates. Because how do you put into words what it feels like to see the fire in your partner's eyes dim for the first time? Not from failure, but from fear. Insiders backstage say Becky eventually walked out alone. Her head down. Hood up. Security offered to escort her out of the building, but she refused. Instead, she wandered into the production hallway, leaned against a black equipment crate, and cried. Not for show. Not because a camera was watching. But because, for the first time in years, the woman known to the world as the man felt powerless. One backstage source described it in hushed tones. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just, still. Like she was mourning something before it had even been taken away. Later that night, Triple H was seen leaving Seth's room, his expression grave. Rumors swirled that contingency plans were being formed not just for SummerSlam, but for the next 9 months of Raw. What happens when your cornerstone falls? What happens when your ace is benched, not by storyline, but by biology? The question now wasn't just whether Seth Rollins could recover. It was whether WWE could survive the emotional fallout, because this wasn't just an injury. This was a seismic shift. The kind that redefines careers. The kind that forces even legends to ask themselves if the ring is still worth the risk. And for Becky, it went deeper than wrestling. This was the man who held her hand through childbirth. The man who stood beside her as she battled her way back to the top after her own injuries and doubts. The man who, night after night, kissed her forehead before heading into arenas packed with people screaming for blood. Now, he was the one in pieces. And she could do nothing. In the days that followed, the news leaked. Slowly. Carefully. WWE issued a vague statement: Seth Rollins sustained a knee injury at Saturday Night Main Event and is undergoing evaluation. But insiders were already whispering the truth: the injury was bad. Much worse than they let on. Medical insiders claimed the fracture was more complicated than initially believed. The risk of long-term complications loomed. One WWE trainer reportedly told a colleague, "It's the kind of injury that ends people." And while no one wanted to say it out loud, everyone was thinking it: is this the end of Seth Rollins' in-ring future? Back at home in Davenport, Iowa, Becky sat with Seth in silence. The house, normally filled with their daughter's laughter and Seth's post-show storytelling, was unusually quiet. Rollins, whose entire life revolved around movement, physical, verbal, theatrical, was now confined to a couch. Immobilized. Frustrated. And haunted. One of Becky's closest friends later said, he kept replaying the moment in his head. Over and over. Trying to figure out if he could have avoided it. He couldn't sleep. He didn't talk much. And that scared her. But what truly broke Becky wasn't the diagnosis. It was watching the man she loved unravel in slow motion. She saw the guilt in his eyes. The way he avoided their daughter when he struggled to stand. The way he shut the door during physical therapy calls. The way he smiled less. Laughed less. Moved less. He was still there. Still present. But it felt like pieces of him were disappearing. One quiet hour at a time. Then came the moment that shattered her. Late one evening, Becky walked into the living room and found Seth staring out the window. The TV was on mute. His crutches leaned against the wall. And he was crying. Not sobbing. Not breaking down. Just crying, soft, steady tears that fell without invitation. She sat beside him, unsure of what to say. And then he whispered it. What if I can't come back? It wasn't a question. It was a confession. And it crushed her. Becky didn't answer. She didn't promise anything. She just held him, arms wrapped tightly around a man who had always been her rock, now shaken, now questioning, now afraid. And in that embrace, the weight of every arena, every match, every chant, every sacrifice they had both made over the last decade came crashing down. Because it wasn't just his dream on the line. It was theirs. The fans had no idea what was unfolding in that quiet Iowa home. On social media, debates raged about replacement matches. Fantasy booking took over Reddit. Some speculated that this could be a work. That Rollins was playing the long game. That he'd return with a vengeance at WrestleMania. But none of them saw the look in Becky's eyes that night backstage. None of them saw the way she stood frozen when the doctor said, "We're looking at a 9 to 12-month recovery, best case." And now, as the dust settles, a new question rises: what becomes of a champion when the roar of the crowd fades and the silence of injury takes its place? What happens to love when it's forced to wait in a room filled with uncertainty? For Becky Lynch, that question lingers every morning she wakes up beside a man she once watched slay giants, now struggling to climb the stairs. She smiles for their daughter. She shows strength for the cameras. But in the quiet, in the kitchen at midnight, in the brief pauses between updates from doctors and agents and publicists, she weeps. Softly. Alone. And somewhere deep down, she wonders. If this is the end of Seth Rollins' career, what will that do to the man she loves? WWE has always been a place of spectacle, of legends, comebacks, betrayals, and miracles. But even in a world where storylines are crafted for drama, where champions rise from ashes night after night, there are moments that are too real to script. Moments like this. Moments where the cameras stop rolling, and what's left behind is raw, painful humanity. Seth Rollins had long prided himself on being unbreakable. He was the workhorse of WWE, the man who showed up when others couldn't, the Iron Man who pulled double duty for years without complaint. He was the glue of Monday Night Raw, the face of a new generation, the one who carried titles and burdens with equal weight. And now, for the first time since his early days in FCW, he was sidelined with nothing but time and silence. Inside the company, the ripple effects of his injury were immediate. Creative meetings were abruptly shifted. Plans for SummerSlam, Survivor Series, and even the Royal Rumble had to be torn down and rebuilt. Several rising stars who had been slated to feud with Seth were rerouted into other storylines. His title hopes? Gone. His redemption arc with Paul Heyman? On ice. For the WWE machine, this was just another setback to manage. But for the man at the center of it, this was identity collapse. As for Becky Lynch, her public image remained intact. The man was still showing up for press calls, still cutting promos, still delivering in-ring excellence. But those closest to her could see it, the hollowness in her eyes, the shortness of her breath when Seth's name came up. She was performing now, not just in the ring but in real life. Pretending the weight of the world hadn't shifted onto her shoulders. WWE's internal medical team had been relentless in their testing and analysis. And eventually, the words no one wanted to hear became unavoidable: micro-tears in the ACL. A degenerative meniscus. The knee had taken too much over too many years. Surgery wouldn't just be repair, it would be reconstruction. And recovery wouldn't just be physical. It would be mental, emotional, spiritual. Seth Rollins would need to rebuild not just his leg, but his entire sense of who he was. One WWE doctor reportedly said, "We're not just looking at rehab. We're looking at redefinition." This is career-altering. Another insider close to the Performance Center confided, "Seth's in a psychological free fall. He doesn't know who he is without the ring." And Becky, she's watching it all unfold, powerless. There was one moment that made its way through the locker room like wildfire, a moment that no one captured on camera, but everyone spoke about. It happened in Orlando, weeks after the injury, when Seth and Becky were invited to the Performance Center for a consult. Seth was wheeled into the facility, still refusing to use crutches, still trying to prove that he could conquer this with willpower alone. And after the consultation ended, he asked to sit in the empty training ring. They helped him up the steel steps. Becky walked beside him, holding his hand as if he were a student again. Once he was in the center of the ring, he looked around, at the ropes, the canvas, the walls of banners and posters bearing his name, and he cried. Not like a man defeated, but like a man who feared he might never feel this again. Becky sat beside him and held him close, and for several minutes, they just sat there. No cameras. No tweets. Just silence. Just grief. Later, a coach who witnessed the moment said, "It wasn't about the injury. It was about what the injury took away. The part of him that lit up when he walked through the curtain, that's what Becky was watching disappear. That's what she was mourning." Meanwhile, fans continued to speculate. Is he done for good? Will we see him in the Rumble? Could he return at WrestleMania? But the truth was more complicated. Seth wasn't sure anymore if returning was worth it. He didn't say it out loud, but Becky saw it in the way he avoided rehab some days. In the way he stopped watching old matches. In the way he flinched when their daughter asked, "When's Daddy going back to work?" Those were the wounds no surgery could fix. And still, Becky didn't break in public. She couldn't. Not yet. But friends say she had begun writing again, journaling, late at night, the way she used to before her rise to stardom. One of her closest friends read a passage she had written and said it felt like a letter to someone she was losing slowly. The line that stood out the most: "He gave me everything when I didn't believe in myself. Now I have to hold him together while he forgets who he is." Backstage, WWE began discussing the inevitable. Would Seth vacate all remaining obligations? Would they acknowledge the injury openly? Or would they keep it vague and mysterious, hoping for a surprise return someday? Sources say Triple H wanted to protect him, give him time, space, whatever he needs. But others inside the company were already thinking in terms of replacements. That was the moment Becky stepped in. Sources close to the situation claim Becky requested a private meeting with WWE's top brass. Not as a performer. Not as the man. But as a partner, a mother, and someone who refused to let the company treat Seth like a broken asset. She reportedly said, "We owe him more than a press release. We owe him dignity." And for once, everyone listened. A new plan was formed, not to erase Seth, but to honor him. Footage was collected. A documentary crew was quietly greenlit. WWE began compiling tributes, interviews, reflections. If this truly was the end, or even just the end of one chapter, then it would be told with reverence, not silence. But behind the scenes, the emotional battle raged on. Seth had begun therapy, not just physical, but psychological. And in those sessions, the core truth emerged: the injury wasn't the enemy. The loss of identity was. For so long, he had been Seth freakin' Rollins, the visionary, the architect, the champion. Now, he was just a man learning how to walk again. A man facing the terrifying possibility that his body might never be enough for his soul's calling. And Becky? She was caught between two selves, the public warrior and the private caregiver. She still stood tall on TV, still rallied the crowd, still fought with fire in her eyes. But backstage, she became someone else entirely. A woman quietly asking producers for extra time off. A mother trying to maintain normalcy for a daughter who didn't understand why Daddy wouldn't wrestle anymore. A partner staring down the abyss of a future she never planned for. Their love, however, never wavered. If anything, it deepened. Because there's something sacred about loving someone through uncertainty. Something fierce about staying when everything else is falling apart. And that's what Becky did. One night, after tucking their daughter into bed, she sat beside Seth on the couch. His leg was elevated. His eyes were red from therapy. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not a forced one, not for show, but a real smile. "You think I'll wrestle again?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Becky looked at him, then down at the knee, then back at the man she had fought beside and fought for, and she said, "I think no matter what happens, the world hasn't seen the last of you. The question now is, what form will Seth Rollins take next? Will the visionary rise again in the ring? Or will he become something more, a mentor, a legend, a symbol of endurance beyond performance? And for Becky Lynch, how does a warrior find peace when the battlefield moves into the home? This is not the end. But it is the reckoning. As the weeks passed, Becky Lynch began to operate on two timelines, the one the world could see, and the one she lived in silence. On screen, she was the same fierce competitor, arms raised to the crowd, grit carved into her every promo. But off-screen, each moment with Seth was a delicate dance around pain, physical, emotional, existential. WWE fans applauded her resilience, calling her unstoppable. What they didn't see was that every time she stepped out into the spotlight, she was carrying the weight of two dreams, her own, and the one Seth might never live again. Friends close to the couple say the emotional toll was beginning to show. Not in explosions or fights, but in fragments, long silences between conversations, small flinches at simple questions. One friend described it as watching two people trying to keep the roof on a house during a slow-moving storm. Their daughter remained their center, their anchor. But even she could sense the shift. Children are intuitive like that. They feel sadness, even when no one says the word. Becky had always been the fire. Seth was the architect, the strategist, the one who thought 10 moves ahead while she lit the room with passion. But now, she was building the plans, keeping the structure from crumbling while he searched for the spark he'd lost. One morning, Seth insisted on going outside to walk without assistance. He waved off the crutches. Becky didn't argue, she knew that part of his recovery meant failing on his own terms. He made it about 30 feet before his leg buckled and he nearly fell. She caught him. Not just physically, but emotionally. She didn't speak. She just held him upright as he leaned into her shoulder. Champions don't always fight in arenas. Sometimes, they fight in backyards, with shaking legs and eyes filled with frustration. Later that day, he whispered, "I'm scared, Bex." And those words broke her heart in ways the ring never could. Inside WWE headquarters, the tone began to shift. The reality had set in. Seth Rollins, the man penciled into every major pay-per-view plan, was gone for the foreseeable future. His absence wasn't a storyline twist. It was a void. And WWE doesn't pause for voids. It moves on. Fast. New stars were pushed forward. New feuds launched. The show went on. But something was missing. Backstage producers noted it. Younger talent mentioned it in hushed tones. "It's just not the same without him here," one said. Another admitted, "He was the guy we all looked to, he set the bar. Now that bar feels out of reach." Becky noticed it too. Not just in how others looked at her, but in how often people asked, "How's he doing?" And then avoided eye contact when she answered. Because no one really wanted to hear the truth. That the most charismatic, technically gifted performer of his generation was barely able to get out of bed some mornings. That his recovery was plateauing. That even with the best surgeons and therapists, the human body sometimes doesn't care about timing. Or legacy. Then came the meeting that changed everything. WWE officials reached out to Becky and Seth with a proposal, a sit-down interview. A chance to set the record straight, to speak directly to fans, to control the narrative. It would be edited with care, they promised. No pressure. Just a conversation. Becky was hesitant. Seth, more so. But eventually, they agreed. Not for the brand. Not for the press. But because maybe, just maybe, it would help him start to heal. The interview took place in a quiet studio in Connecticut. No lights blaring. No audience. Just 2 chairs, a camera, and a moment they could never take back. Seth was the one who broke the silence. "This isn't how I wanted my summer to go," he said, managing a dry laugh. "I was supposed to walk into SummerSlam as champion. Now I'm just trying to walk, period." Becky smiled faintly. "And you will." When asked about the injury, Seth didn't sugarcoat it. "It's the worst I've had. And it came at the worst time. I've had setbacks before. But this feels like a crossroads." The interviewer leaned in. "Do you think you'll wrestle again?" Seth looked at Becky, then at the camera. "I don't know," he said quietly. And that's the hardest part. For Becky, the question was different. "What's it been like supporting him through this?" She paused. And then her eyes welled up. "It's been hard," she admitted. "Because I know what wrestling means to him. It's not just a job. It's who he is. Watching him doubt that, watching him think he's not enough anymore, that's been the hardest part. I'd take the pain for him if I could. But I can't. All I can do is love him through it." That clip would later go viral. Not because it was dramatic. But because it was real. The strongest woman in WWE, holding back tears as she spoke about the man the world thought was unshakable. Fans responded in waves. Support flooded social media. Former superstars, rival companies, even longtime critics posted messages of solidarity. "You've got this, champ. Take your time. Come back when you're ready. We believe in you." And for the first time since the injury, Seth began to believe it too. Back home, the energy changed. Slowly. Subtly. But it changed. Seth committed harder to rehab. He stopped avoiding phone calls. He let himself laugh again. He even pulled Becky aside one night and said, "If I come back, I want it to be on my terms. Not just because people expect it, but because I still love it." She didn't need to respond. The tears in her eyes said enough. Their daughter, too young to understand the scale of what was happening, became their lighthouse. Her drawings taped to the fridge featured stick figures with championship belts and big smiles. When Seth asked her who the belt was for, she always answered the same way, "You, Daddy." Those little things mattered. They reminded him that even if the world didn't wait, his world, the one that truly mattered, was still here. Still fighting for him. Then, without announcement or press, Seth returned to the performance center. Not for cameras. Not for content. But to see if the ring still felt like home. Becky came too. She watched from the sidelines as he stepped between the ropes, his brace still visible, his gait still tentative. He didn't do much. A few drills. Some footwork. A slow-motion bump. But when he stood up and caught Becky's gaze, she saw it. The flicker. The fire. Later that evening, she posted a photo. Black and white. No caption. Just his boots sitting next to hers on the ring apron. The internet exploded. WWE fans knew what it meant. The story wasn't over. It may take months. It may take a year. But Seth Rollins, the visionary, the architect, the man who nearly lost himself, is building again. Not just his body. But his belief. And Becky Lynch? She's not just the man anymore. She's the foundation. The reason he didn't give up. The one who carried the torch when his light went dim. Together, they're walking the long road back. And this time, it's not about belts. Or main events. Or proving anything. It's about healing. It's about family. It's about love that holds firm, even when knees give out. And it leaves us with one final question. In a world where everything is scripted, what happens when real life writes the most painful, most beautiful chapter of all? Weeks turned into months. The calendar advanced, but for Seth Rollins, time moved differently now. Rehab was a grind, not just physically, but spiritually. Each session tested not just his knee, but his patience. There were days when he pushed through the pain like the warrior he'd always been. But there were also days when the mirror stared back at him, full of doubt, full of shadows. Becky stayed close, but never overbearing. She knew when to offer a hand and when to simply be there. Sometimes, that meant sitting in the hallway outside the rehab center, listening to the soft thuds of his falls and recoveries. Sometimes it meant holding their daughter's hand as she asked why Daddy wasn't on TV anymore. And sometimes, it meant nothing more than putting a cold compress on his knee in silence, no words exchanged, only love. Then, in late August, the doctors gave him news that shifted the horizon. His progress had accelerated. The swelling had gone down. The reconstructed ligament was holding stronger than expected. If you stay on this trajectory, they said, we could be looking at an in-ring return within the next 7 months. WrestleMania's not off the table. Those words, WrestleMania, meant more to Seth than the doctors could have imagined. Not because of the spectacle, not even because of legacy. But because it gave him a mountain to climb again. And for the first time in months, he wasn't just surviving. He had a purpose again. When he told Becky that night, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "Let's get you home." And so began the second phase of recovery, not just from injury, but from identity loss. Seth Rollins was no longer dragging himself through rehab. He was charging into it. Tapes of past matches became his morning ritual. He revisited his greatest moments, his Money in the Bank cash-in, his gauntlet match marathon, his bouts with Roman, Cody, AJ, Cena, Edge. He didn't watch them to mourn the past. He watched them to remember who he was. But as his body began to recover, the emotional weight remained. One night, Seth sat beside Becky and confessed something that had been gnawing at him. "I was afraid you'd stop seeing me as a man if I couldn't be that guy anymore." Becky looked at him, hard, unwavering. "You're more of a man now than you've ever been. The guy who wrestled for 40 minutes on one leg? That's the surface. The man who stayed when it all fell apart. That's who I see." She meant it. Every word. But behind her strength, Becky had her own battles. Being the partner of an injured icon came with a different kind of toll, one of invisibility. As she continued to show up on Raw, cut promos, headline matches, and carry rivalries on her back, the spotlight felt lonelier than ever. Without Seth by her side, the locker room felt colder. The cheers felt thinner. The stakes felt heavier. One night, after a particularly grueling match, she sat alone in her hotel room and wrote in her journal again. This time, the entry read, "I'm not fighting the match in front of me. I'm fighting the one that's waiting at home." Meanwhile, the WWE universe buzzed with speculation. Cryptic tweets. Teasers. A sudden pause in Becky's post-match interview when asked about Seth. Something was coming. Or someone. Then, in a move that shocked everyone backstage, Becky requested time off. She wasn't injured. She wasn't burned out. She simply needed time. Time to be a partner, not a performer. WWE granted her the leave. Quietly. Respectfully. And so, for the first time in years, neither Becky Lynch nor Seth Rollins was active on the WWE roster. Fans noticed. Podcasts speculated. Headlines wondered, is this the end of an era? But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Healing. Connection. A rediscovery of what life looked like without the chaos of constant travel and television lights. Seth and Becky took their daughter on road trips. They cooked meals together. They talked about the future, not just WrestleMania or championship gold, but real things. Legacy. Health. What it meant to grow older in a business that never stops for anything, not even pain. And for the first time in months, they laughed again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't broadcasted. But it was real. Then came the moment that shifted everything once more. In early November, Seth received a call. It was from WWE's medical director. The latest scans were back. The ligament had healed better than expected. The meniscus damage had stabilized. The brace could come off in the next 4 weeks. He hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a full minute. Then he walked outside, barefoot on the cool grass, and yelled. Not in pain. Not in frustration. In triumph. Becky heard it from the kitchen. She ran out, thinking something was wrong. And there he was, arms outstretched, eyes toward the sky, laughing. "I'm coming back," he said through tears. "I'm really coming back." They held each other on the lawn, surrounded by nothing but wind, hope, and the future. The next day, Becky called WWE. "We're not done," she said. Plans were set into motion. Quiet, secret plans. Production meetings. Video packages. Music cues. But there was no date. No exact return. Because Seth wanted it on his terms. Becky, too, was preparing her own return. Not just to TV, but to a story that would honor everything they'd just lived through. And WWE, to its credit, listened. Meanwhile, Seth began showing up at the performance center more often. Not to train. Not yet. But to teach. To share. To rebuild not just himself, but others. Younger superstars looked up to him. And now, he had the time to pour into them. One performance center coach said, "Seth may not realize it yet, but this version of him? The teacher, the mentor, the guy who came back from the edge? He might be even more valuable than the champion we lost." But even as that version grew, the ring still called. Every night, before bed, Seth watched a different WrestleMania. Not to study. Just to remember. And every time he looked at Becky, he saw it, the belief. The steady flame she never let go out, even when he did. So when the call came from WWE to discuss his official return date, Seth didn't hesitate. WrestleMania, he said. That's where it ends. Or that's where it begins again. Because now, it wasn't just about him. It was about the comeback. The redemption. The fight that never aired on television, but defined them more than any championship ever could. WrestleMania is months away. The plans are in motion. And whether Seth walks down that ramp as a surprise return or in a publicized comeback match, one thing is clear, the man who lost everything for a moment is coming back with more than he ever had before. And beside him? The woman who never walked away. The man and the visionary. Still standing. Still loving. Still fighting. Together.